one of the greatest basketball players ever, was asked a simple question. He had shared the floor with Hall of Famers. He had won championships surrounded by legends whose numbers now hang in the rafters. He had every reason to name any one of a dozen icons. And instead he named a guard that most fans could barely pick out of a lineup. He said, without hesitation, without qualification, that this was the best player he had ever played with in his entire life. And the basketball world laughed. They thought he was joking. They thought anything except the one thing that was actually true, which was that Larry Bird meant every single word of it. The man he was talking about was Dennis Johnson. In this video, we are going to tell you the story of the most underappreciated great player in the history of the National Basketball Association. A man who was cut from his high school team, who was labeled a cancer and shipped out of town, who was traded twice before his 29th birthday because nobody could see what he really was. A man who choked away a championship on the biggest stage in the sport, and then came back the very next year to win the whole thing and take home the Most Valuable Player award in the finals. A man who made the winning basket on the most famous play in Boston Celtics history. A play that everyone remembers for the wrong person. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand why it took 15 years after he retired and 3 years after he died before the sport finally admitted what Larry Bird had been screaming from the mountaintop the entire time. That the quiet man from Compton was one of the greatest to ever do it. But to understand why nobody listened, you first have to understand where Dennis Johnson came from, because almost nothing about his story was supposed to end the way it did. Dennis Wayne Johnson was born on September 18, 1954 in Los Angeles, California, and raised in Compton. He was the 8th of 16 children. Think about that number for a second. 16 kids in one family. His father was a bricklayer and his mother was a social worker, and in a household that size, nobody was handed anything. You learned to fight for what you got, or you got nothing at all. And here is the part that nobody expected. Dennis Johnson was not some can't-miss prodigy who dominated from the moment he picked up a basketball. He was, by his own admission, a late bloomer in the most literal sense. He stood only about 5'9" as a teenager. He did not even make his high school varsity team until his senior year at Dominguez High School. And even then, he was hardly a star. He graduated without a single scholarship offer. Not one. No college wanted him. The path that leads a young man to professional basketball simply was not open to him. So he did what a lot of kids in his situation did. He went to work, he took odd jobs, he drove a forklift, he operated a warehouse. And in his spare time, he played street ball, the rough, unforgiving, no-referee basketball of the Los Angeles playgrounds, where reputations were made and broken every single day. And then his body did something remarkable. He grew several inches seemingly overnight. That growth spurt, combined with the toughness he had forged on the blacktop, suddenly made him something worth a second look. He caught on at Los Angeles Harbor College, a community college, where his talent finally started to match his fight. From there, he earned a scholarship to Pepperdine University, where he played exactly 1 season and averaged around 15 points a game. 1 year of major college basketball. That was the entire resume. When the 1976 NBA draft came around, Dennis Johnson was an afterthought. He was selected in the second round, 29th overall, by the Seattle Supersonics. And even he did not think it would amount to anything. He assumed no professional team would ever seriously want him. He was genuinely shocked that Seattle called his name at all. When he arrived in Seattle, the deck was stacked against him. The Sonics already had a crowded backcourt. He barely made the roster. As a rookie, he played limited minutes and scored just over 9 points a game. He was a nobody on a middling team, the kind of player who gets waived and forgotten 100 times a year in this league. And then, everything changed. Midway through the 1977-78 season, the Sonics were a disaster, sitting at 5 wins and 17 losses. The organization brought in a new head coach, a man named Lenny Wilkins. And Wilkins looked at this raw, athletic, hungry second-year guard and saw something. He handed Dennis Johnson a starting job alongside the smooth-scoring Gus Williams. And what happened next was one of the great turnarounds in NBA history. Seattle caught fire. They ripped off a 12-game home winning streak. They finished the season at 47-35 and stormed all the way through the Western Conference, knocking off the Lakers, the defending champion Portland Trail Blazers, and the Denver Nuggets, before arriving in the 1978 NBA Finals against the Washington Bullets. In barely a year and a half, Dennis Johnson had gone from a warehouse worker who could not get a scholarship to a starting guard in the championship round of professional basketball. And this is where the story takes its first cruel turn, because the biggest stage of his young life was about to become the site of his most humiliating failure. The 1978 Finals against Washington was a war. It went the full 7 games, a back-and-forth series where neither team could win 2 in a row. Dennis Johnson was spectacular for stretches. In one game, he blocked 7 shots, which remains the most blocks by a guard in the history of the NBA Finals. 7 blocks from a guard. That is a number that should not be physically possible, and he did it on the biggest stage in the sport. But then came Game 7. Winner take all. On their home floor, and Dennis Johnson fell apart. He could not make a shot to save his life. He attempted 14 field goals in that Game 7, and he missed every single one of them. 0 for 14. He finished with just 4 points in 38 minutes as the Bullets marched into Seattle and stole the title on Seattle's own court, winning it 105-99. The championship that had been right there within arm's reach slipped away. And a huge part of the reason was the young guard who picked the worst possible moment to have the worst game of his life. Johnson never hid from it. Years later, he was completely honest about what happened that night. He said in plain terms that he choked. He did not blame his teammates. He did not blame the coaching. He did not blame the officials. He looked in the mirror and he told the truth. He choked on the biggest stage there was, and it was the single most embarrassing experience of his professional career. For a lot of players, that is where the story ends. That is the moment that defines them forever, the tag that follows them for the rest of their lives. The guy who went 0 for 14. The guy who couldn't come through when it mattered most. In a league that eats the mentally weak alive, most men never recover from a failure that public and that total. But Dennis Johnson was not most men. And what he did next is the reason we are still talking about him today. He made himself a promise. He vowed that he would never, ever be that unprepared for a big moment again. He treated that Game 7 not as a scar, but as a lesson, the most important lesson of his career. He was going to make sure that when the biggest moments came around again, he would be ready. And he got his chance to prove it faster than anyone could have imagined. The following season, in 1978-1979, the Sonics were even better. They finished the regular season strong, and they clawed their way back through the playoffs, and when the smoke cleared, there they stood in the 1979 NBA Finals. And who was waiting for them? The Washington Bullets, the exact same team that had broken their hearts 1 year earlier. The basketball gods had handed Dennis Johnson the perfect stage for redemption. The same opponent, the same stakes, 1 year of pain to fuel him. This time, there would be no choke. The Sonics dropped Game 1, and then they did something almost nobody does in a finals. They won 4 straight games to close out the series and claim the championship. And the man in the middle of it all, the man who exorcised every demon from the year before, was Dennis Johnson. He was magnificent. He averaged nearly 23 points a game in that series, along with around 6 rebounds and 6 assists. He poured in 32 points in a pivotal Game 4 overtime win. And when it was over, when Seattle had its first and only championship in franchise history, the NBA Finals Most Valuable Player award went to Dennis Johnson. The guy who went 0 for 14 was now the most valuable player of the finals. To this day, he remains the only finals most valuable player in the entire history of the Seattle Supersonics franchise. It is one of the greatest one-year turnarounds the sport has ever seen. From the GOAT, in the worst sense of the word, to the hero. From choking on the biggest stage to owning it. He was 24 years old. He was a champion. He was the finals most valuable player. He was an all-star and an all-defensive selection. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the brightest young guards in the entire league. A player who had just proven he could carry a team to a title and rise to the biggest moment imaginable. And so, naturally, within about a year, Seattle got rid of him. This is where the pattern begins. This is where the story of Dennis Johnson becomes the story of a man that the basketball world kept refusing to see clearly. Because for all his brilliance on the floor, Dennis Johnson had a reputation. He was moody, he was stubborn, he clashed with authority. Back in his community college days, he had butted heads with his coaches, and in Seattle, that same friction returned. He and Lenny Wilkens, the very coach who had made him a starter, began to grate on each other. The relationship soured over the course of the 1979 to 1980 season. And Wilkens, according to reporting from Sports Illustrated, went so far as to label Dennis Johnson a cancer. A cancer. Think about the weight of that word attached to a player, not a difficult personality, not a guy who needs managing. A cancer. Something to be cut out before it spreads. This is what they said about a 25-year-old former Finals Most Valuable player who played suffocating defense and had ice in his veins when the game was on the line. In the summer following that season, Seattle traded him to the Phoenix Suns. They sent the reigning face of their championship, one of the best young two-way guards in the sport, to the desert in exchange for Paul Westphal. And that was the end of the Seattle era. The Sonics would not return to the Western Conference Finals for another 7 years. In Phoenix, the pattern repeated itself almost exactly. On the court, Dennis Johnson was excellent. He made 2 more All-Star teams in his 3 seasons with the Suns. He continued to be one of the premier defensive guards in the entire league. He continued to do the winning things, the little things. The things that show up in victories but not always in box scores. But off the court, the same story played out. The Suns ran a disciplined, structured system under coach John McLeod, and Dennis Johnson's temperament rubbed against it. Sports Illustrated later reported that Phoenix moved on from him because his attitude, in their view, simply did not fit their disciplined system. So before the 1983-84 season, Phoenix traded him too. This time to the Boston Celtics, in exchange for a backup center named Rick Roby and some draft considerations. A former Finals MVP, a perennial all-defensive guard, a proven winner and clutch performer, traded essentially for a role-playing big man. Read that again. 2 different franchises in the span of 3 years looked at Dennis Johnson and decided he was more trouble than he was worth. They saw the reputation, they saw the attitude, they saw the friction, and they could not or would not see the greatness underneath. 2 teams gave up on one of the best guards in basketball. Nobody was listening to what the game itself was trying to tell them about this man. And then he arrived in Boston, and everything Larry Bird had been waiting for walked through the door. Red Auerbach, the legendary Celtics architect, was one of the great talent evaluators in the history of American sports. And he saw exactly what Dennis Johnson was. He saw a defensive stopper who could guard the biggest, most dangerous guards in the league. He saw a big, physical playmaker at 6'4" who could initiate offense, hit the clutch shot, and lock down the other team's best perimeter scorer. He saw the missing piece. The Celtics had won the title in 1981, but they had run into a wall. In 1982, they were beaten by the Philadelphia 76ers. In 1983, they were swept out of the playoffs by the Milwaukee Bucks. They needed something. They needed a guard who could do the dirty work, who could guard people like Andrew Toney, the Philadelphia scorer they called the Boston Strangler because of how thoroughly he tormented them. They needed a competitor who did not shrink from the biggest moments. And in Dennis Johnson, they got all of it. The transformation was immediate. In Dennis Johnson's very first season in Boston, the 1983 to 1984 season, the Celtics won the championship. They beat the Los Angeles Lakers in a brutal 7-game finals. 2 years later, in 1985 to 1986, they did it again on a Celtics team that is regularly mentioned in the conversation for the greatest single-season team in NBA history. Dennis Johnson was the starting point guard on both of those title teams. 3 championships now, on 2 different franchises, as the leading man in Seattle and the crucial complementary star in Boston. And this is where Larry Bird started talking, and nobody believed him. Larry Bird had played with an incredible collection of talent over his career. He had shared the floor with Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish, 2 of the greatest front-court players who ever lived, both destined for the Hall of Fame. He had played with Bill Walton, one of the most gifted big men in history. He had played with Tiny Archibald, with Dave Cowens, with Cedric Maxwell, with a roster stacked with all-stars and legends. If you asked most people to guess who Larry Bird considered the best teammate he ever had, they would name McHale or Parrish or Walton. But when Larry Bird was asked, he did not name any of them. During an interview in the mid-1980s with the legendary broadcaster Chick Hearn, Bird said flatly that Dennis Johnson was the best player he had ever played with in his life. Hearn was so surprised that he asked Bird if he was serious or just kidding. And Bird, with that famous dry wit, shot back that he had not played with very many good ones. It was a joke, of course, a way of needling McHale and Parrish and everyone else. But the underlying point was dead serious. Bird explained exactly why. He said Dennis Johnson made him better. He said DJ got him the ball in his spots better than anyone he had ever played with. Tiny Archibald used to do it, Bird said, but Dennis did it better than anybody. He said Dennis was the key to the whole team. He said that the moment Boston acquired him and saw how good he really was, they knew they were going to win a championship. Not hoped, knew. And the basketball world did not take it seriously. They filed it away as a nice compliment. They assumed Bird was being generous or humble or clever, or that he was trying to build up a role player's confidence. The idea that Dennis Johnson, a guard who averaged around 14 points a game for his career, could actually be better than Kevin McHale or Robert Parrish struck people as absurd. It did not compute. So they smiled and they nodded and they moved on. And they did not listen. But Larry Bird was not being modest. Larry Bird was one of the smartest basketball minds who ever lived, a man who saw the game in a way almost nobody else could. And he was telling everyone, plainly over and over, exactly what he had learned by standing next to Dennis Johnson every single night. He was telling them that the numbers did not capture it, that the reputation did not capture it, that the things Dennis Johnson did to win basketball games were the most valuable things on the floor, and that most people were simply too distracted by points and flash to notice. Consider what Dennis Johnson actually did on those Celtics teams. He guarded the toughest assignment on the perimeter every single night. He drew Magic Johnson in the finals, matching his size and strength against the greatest point guard alive, one of the only defenders in the league physically built to make Magic work for everything. He was the answer to Andrew Toney, the Philadelphia sharpshooter who had been carving Boston to pieces, the man whose scoring had earned him the nickname the Boston Strangler. When Dennis Johnson arrived, that problem quieted down. That is what he did. He took the other team's biggest weapon and he made it disappear. He was named to the NBA All-Defensive Team 9 consecutive seasons, 6 times on the first team. 9 straight years recognized as one of the best defenders in the entire league at his position. Not one great year, not a hot stretch. Nearly a decade of sustained elite, championship-level defense against the best backcourt scorers the sport could throw at him. He was a 5-time All-Star. He handled the ball, he ran the offense, he set the table for Bird and McHale, and then he turned around and shut down the other team's best scorer. He did the job of 2 players and asked for the credit of none. Understand what that combination actually means. In an era overflowing with legendary guards, in a league that had Magic and Isaiah and Jervin and Tony all operating at the peak of their powers, Dennis Johnson was the man opposing coaches game planned around and the man his own coach trusted with the ball in the final seconds. Offense and defense, playmaking and lockdown, the rarest kind of player there is, the two-way guard who tilts a championship series without ever needing the spotlight. And when the game was on the line, he wanted the ball. He had ice water in his veins. Which brings us to the single most famous play in modern Celtics history. A play that captures the tragedy of how Dennis Johnson was remembered better than any statistic ever could. It was May 26, 1987. Game 5 of the Eastern Conference Finals, the Boston Celtics against the young, vicious, tough-as-nails Detroit Pistons, the team that would soon come to be known as the Bad Boys. The series was tied at 2 games apiece, and Game 5 was a dogfight down to the final seconds. With 5 seconds left on the clock, the Pistons led by a single point, 107-106, and Detroit had the ball. All they had to do was inbound it cleanly, get fouled, and go home with a chance to close out the series. For all intents and purposes, the game was over. The Celtics were dead. Isaiah Thomas stepped to the baseline to inbound the ball. He looked to find Bill Laimbeer, one of Detroit's best free throw shooters. And Larry Bird, reading the play with that supernatural instinct of his, jumped the passing lane and stole the inbounds pass right out of the air. He caught it just before tumbling out of bounds along the baseline, and in that split second of chaos, with his momentum carrying him off the court, Bird had to find somebody, anybody, and he had to do it instantly. And here is the part that history forgets. At that exact moment, Dennis Johnson was already moving. He did not stand and watch. He did not freeze. The instant Bird made the steal, Dennis Johnson broke from the foul line and cut hard to the basket, reading the entire play as it unfolded, understanding before almost anyone in the building what was about to happen. Bird whipped the ball to him, and Dennis Johnson caught it in stride and laid it in off the glass with 1 second left on the clock. Celtics 108, Pistons 107. The Boston Garden erupted. Johnny Most delivered his immortal call, screaming about the steal by Bird and how it went underneath to DJ, who laid it in. Now think about how that play is remembered. Ask any basketball fan, and they will tell you about Larry Bird's steal. The steal. It is Bird's play, Bird's moment, Bird's highlight, replayed for decades as one of the greatest heads-up plays in the history of the sport. And it was. Bird's steal was extraordinary. But it was not a one-man play. The reporter Peter May, who was in the building that night, pointed out years later the thing that so often gets lost in the retelling. Just as clutch as Bird's steal was Dennis Johnson's lightning-quick decision to break to the basket at the perfect angle at the perfect instant. Without that cut, the steal is nothing. Bird has no one to pass to, tumbles out of bounds, and the Pistons win. It was Dennis Johnson's basketball intelligence, his anticipation, his refusal to stand still, that turned a great defensive play into a game-winning miracle. And almost nobody remembers his half of it. That, right there, is the entire career of Dennis Johnson compressed into 6 seconds. He made the winning basket on the most iconic play in Celtics history, and it is remembered as somebody else's moment. He did the essential thing, the winning thing, and the credit floated somewhere else. He was the quiet, indispensable engine of a machine that everyone loved to watch. And when the applause came, it went to the flashier parts. Larry Bird understood exactly what he had. Everyone else was still watching the wrong player. Dennis Johnson kept doing it, night after night, year after year, until he finally retired in 1990, after the Celtics chose not to offer him a new contract. He walked away with a resume that, when you actually lay it out, is staggering. 3 NBA championships, an NBA Finals MVP, 5 All-Star selections, 9 consecutive All-Defensive Team honors. He scored more than 15,000 points in his career. He handed out nearly 5,500 assists. He was, without any exaggeration, one of the finest two-way guards the sport had ever produced. A man who could win you a title with his defense, his playmaking, and his nerve. And then the sport made him wait. Dennis Johnson became eligible for the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in 1995, and the call did not come. Not that year, not the next year, not the year after that. Year after year after year, the Hall of Fame looked at that resume: 3 rings, a Finals MVP, 9 straight all-defensive teams, the endorsement of Larry Bird himself, and decided that Dennis Johnson could keep waiting. They let in other players. They let in players with thinner cases, players who had never carried a team to a title, players who had never anchored a defense the way he had. And Dennis Johnson sat outside the door. The writer Bill Simmons, one of the most influential basketball voices of his era, called it what it was: a travesty. He pointed out that Dennis Johnson had a stronger case than plenty of guards who sailed right in. He argued for years that DJ belonged in Springfield, that the failure to enshrine him was a genuine injustice, an oversight that the sport should have been embarrassed by. But the voters did not listen, just like Seattle did not listen, just like Phoenix did not listen, just like the fans who chuckled at Larry Bird did not listen. Dennis Johnson went into coaching after his playing days. He worked as an assistant with the Celtics, he had a stint as an interim head coach with the Los Angeles Clippers, and eventually he landed in the developmental leagues, coaching the Austin Toros of what was then the NBA's minor league system. He was still in the game, still teaching, still passing on everything he knew about how to win the way he had won, with defense and toughness and intelligence. And on February 22, 2007, after running a practice with the Austin Toros, Dennis Johnson collapsed. He suffered a heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital, but he could not be saved. He died that day in Austin, Texas. He was 52 years old. He never got the call. In all the years he was eligible, in all the years he waited, the Hall of Fame never came. Dennis Johnson died without ever being told by the institution that guards the memory of the sport he gave his life to, that he was one of the greats. He never got to stand at that podium. He never got to give the speech. He never got to be walked out by the teammates and coaches who knew exactly what he had meant. 3 years later, in 2010, the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame finally opened its doors to Dennis Johnson. He was inducted posthumously, alongside a class that included Scottie Pippen and Karl Malone. His wife Donna accepted the honor in his place, and she wept at the podium as she tried to find the words to thank a sport that had made her husband wait so long that he did not live to see the day. It was at last the recognition he had earned 2 decades earlier. But it came 15 years after he became eligible. It came 3 years after his heart gave out. It came too late for the man himself to ever know it happened. And that is the cruelest part of the whole story. The system was so slow, so blind, so unwilling to see what was right in front of it, that vindication only arrived when the man it belonged to was no longer alive to feel it. And through all of it, from the very beginning, one voice never wavered. When Dennis Johnson was finally elected to the Hall of Fame, Larry Bird spoke about it, and there was no surprise in his words, only relief. He said it was very special, that they had been waiting for this day for a long time. And then he said the same thing he had been saying for a quarter of a century, the same thing that people had laughed off and dismissed and refused to take seriously all those years ago. He said Dennis Johnson was the best player he ever played with. He said it in the 1980s to Chick Hearn, and they thought he was kidding. He said it during his final playing season, calling DJ probably the best player he ever played with, a guy who did not just pass him the ball but could make plays himself. He said it when the Hall of Fame finally came calling. He never stopped saying it. Because Larry Bird, of all people, understood what he had watched every single night. He understood that the things that win basketball games are not always the things that fill a highlight reel. He understood that Dennis Johnson got him the ball in his spots, guarded the other team's best player into the ground, and made the winning play when it mattered most over and over and over again. Larry Bird was one of the greatest players and one of the sharpest basketball minds the game has ever known. And when a man like that tells you, repeatedly, for 25 years, that a quiet guard from Compton was the best teammate he ever had, you should probably listen the first time. The basketball world did not listen the first time. It did not listen the 10th time. Seattle called him a cancer and traded him. Phoenix decided he did not fit and traded him. The fans chuckled at Bird's compliment. The Hall of Fame voters passed him over for 15 years. And the most famous play he ever finished is remembered as someone else's masterpiece. But Larry Bird was right. He was right about Dennis Johnson from the very first day, and he stayed right long after the man was gone. The 3 championships were real. The Finals MVP was real. The 9 straight all-defensive teams were real. The clutch shots and the shutdown defense and the winning basket in the Boston Garden were all real. Dennis Johnson was exactly what Larry Bird always said he was, one of the greatest to ever play the game. It just took the rest of the world about 30 years and one man's death to finally admit it. That is the story of Dennis Johnson, the best player Larry Bird ever played with, the man who was told he was not enough by everyone except the one person whose opinion should have mattered most, and a reminder that greatness does not always look the way we expect it to, and that the people who see it clearly are not always the ones we listen to. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of basketball's most underappreciated legends, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the golden age of the NBA. Because there are a lot more players like Dennis Johnson out there. Men who did the winning things, the quiet things, the things that got forgotten. And they deserve to have their stories told.